is a non-resident fellow at the Kennedy School, a faculty of the American University of Beirut, and also a renowned journalist for many, many years, and somebody who has a very strong voice and an advocate of Palestinian issues. Over the next couple of weeks, starting with today, we're going to look at the issue of what's going on in Israel right now, and hopefully shed some light on the complexity of the issue and not necessarily look at it in a monolithic way that really doesn't allow us a clear understanding of what the issues on the ground are, as there are issues within the Israeli state, which have to do with political dimensions of Israel. There are also issues within the Palestinian Authority, which also are political and otherwise, and also the great geopolitical forces that have been present in the region for some time. So today we'll start out with Mr. Khouri, and next week we'll have Consul General presenting Israeli position on some of these issues. Now, I ask all of you to turn off your microphones, to be respectful. The idea here is to have a conversation and a discourse. And without further ado, welcome Mr. Khouri. Thank you for taking the invitation and being here with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Petros, and thanks to the Institute of East Mediterranean Studies at Emmanuel College for initiating this and allowing us to be co-hosts with them, and especially thank you to Natalie, Julia, and Maria for all the work behind the scenes. I'm very pleased to share this hour with you and really give you my perspective as a Palestinian American and a Jordanian citizen as well on what's happening. And the dramatic events of the last 10 days really require a wider look at the situation. Right now, as we speak, I'm actually in New York today, and I'm right across the street from the UN, and they're meeting now in an open debate at the General Assembly, and they're trying to get a Security Council meeting going. And all of these immediate political events, as well as the tremendous media coverage, focus on the situation right now. In other words, what's going on? When is the fighting going to stop? When is there going to be a ceasefire? And that tends to be what people look at. And people on both sides give their views, and then you have a ceasefire, and then 3-4 years later it happens again. And this has been going on for many, many years. So that's why we titled this From Sheikh Jarrah to Gaza to Tel Aviv and beyond, looking at the last century of conflict. And I think that's the first point that I would make, is that Sheikh Jarrah, that event where the Israelis were trying to forcibly evict and transfer out of their homes in what is called by many people in the world an ethnic cleansing process, to get rid of these groups of Palestinians out of their homes in Jerusalem, and wherever they go, that's something else, somebody else decides. This has been going on for a long time, but the reason Sheikh Jarrah caught so much attention and sparked so much response among Palestinians first, and then at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the Israelis responded in the Aqsa Mosque with tear gas and police and shooting. And then there were clashes within Palestine and Israel between Palestinians and Israelis. And then Gaza with the Hamas firing its rockets after the Al-Aqsa attack by the Israelis. The Hamas then joined the fray, and the Israelis then fired way disproportionate force against Gaza, killing some Hamas Islamic Jihad fighters, but mostly killing civilians and destroying, I think it's 1,800 homes, the UN announced today. But so this escalating thing, and then you get demonstrations all over the world. In the last week, I went to 2 in Boston, and it was quite extraordinary to see the intense support for Palestinians around the world, and of course the traditional support for Israel, which has always been there. The reason that this event in Sheikh Jarrah of forcibly evicting people from their homes exploded into this big crisis situation is because Sheikh Jarrah is a perfect microcosm of all the issues that define Jerusalem today in relations between Palestinians and Israelis. And Jerusalem is a perfect microcosm of the wider conflict between two forces. One is the force of Zionism versus the force of Arabism, or let's say identities. And the other is the Palestinian versus Israeli. Once the Israeli state was created, you had the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But before that, going back 100 years or more, you had the wider battle between Arabism and Zionism. And for the last century, since, I suppose, you can say people have different views when the conflict started, but let's say the Balfour Declaration, 1917, when Britain supported the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine, a national home in Palestine for the Jewish people. And of course, Britain didn't own the land, didn't have the authority to do that, but it happened. And then migration of Zionists, the Jewish immigrants increased, and gradually, there was a Jewish state in 1948. It was one of the most successful endeavors to create a state or a homeland by any people in the world. Unfortunately, they did it on land that was 93% Palestinian. And the Jewish indigenous population that had always been there was about 5–6% of the people. But they succeeded, and there's been a battle ever since. That's the short version of the century of conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis, or the Palestinians and the Israelis, or Zionism and Arabism. But within that conflict, you have political feuds, territorial feuds, demographic battles, economic battles, and legal battles. Every dimension, even territorial, also includes environmental, so water and minerals and things like that. So every dimension of life has really been impacted by this century of conflict. And the century of conflict, it's important to note, transcends 3 centuries. The Zionist movement was born in 1896–97, when a small group of Jews in Europe decided that they really needed to be a state for the Jewish people, mainly because of the terrible persecution of white Christian Russians and Europeans, and even in the US. So it was 1897 when the Zionist movement was born, and so that was the end of the 19th century, all the 20th, and now into the 21st. So this conflict has spanned really part of 3 centuries, and it's one of the oldest, probably the oldest continuously running conflict in the world. And unless you look at, say, the conflict between white immigrants in North America and the indigenous Native Americans, which of course started before that. But this is really a very old conflict, and the Sheikh Jarrah situation captured all the critical elements. The 2 that are most important from the Palestinian perspective, we say that this is an example of ethnic cleansing, forced migration, and displacement of people, and moving the Palestinians out of Palestine, and trying to replace them not trying, but succeeding in replacing the Palestinians with Jewish immigrants who become Israeli citizens. And this has succeeded spectacularly from the point of view of Zionism. So the forced displacement of people, and the other one was the acquisition of territory. The land of Palestine was historically around 1920. It was around 95–96% owned by Palestinian Arabs, either individually or communally, and 3–4% or something around that was owned by Jews. And so how did this land suddenly, over the next century, become a predominantly Jewish Israeli state with 20% Palestinian Arabs and 80% Jewish Israelis? Well, one of the way it happened is by forced displacement. And this goes back before even the creation of Israel. It goes back to the days of the British Mandate. The British displaced about 150 Palestinians. They moved them, and many of them they pushed out of Palestine. Others they just pushed out of certain areas. The 47–48 war between the Palestinians and the Israelis displaced about another 750,000 Palestinians. Most of them were, well, it's hard to, there's the debate between Israeli historians and Arab historians and others among Israelis themselves. How many fled because there was fighting? How many were ethnically cleansed by Zionist gangs who came in and shot people up like Deir Yassin and other places? And how many just fled because they were afraid of the fighting that was going on, or they were going to be the next ethnically cleansed? And how many were told by Arab leaders to say, move, get out of the way, we're going to come and save you. But the overwhelming majority left because either they were pushed out by the Zionist groups or they fled because they saw the Zionist armed groups coming to get them. And you had another 60,000 internally displaced people over the last century, and 500,000 were displaced after the 1967 war. It's almost 1 million people over the last century that have been forcibly displaced, most of them pushed out of Palestine. Some of them remain there today, including my family in Nazareth. They still remain in their homes. So this forced displacement of people is one issue, and the other one is the acquisition of land. And this is still going on, and that's why Sheikh Jarrah was so poignant and resonated with so many people around the world in a negative way, because it showed these two things going on TV. You could watch on TV or turn on your computer, and there you could see Israeli thugs, private sector settlers, usually with police in the background protecting them, trying to tell the Palestinians of Sheikh Jarrah, get out of here, you don't belong here, even though they held the deeds to those homes from the Jordanian government who built those homes after 1948. And the people in Sheikh Jarrah, the Palestinians, had been forcibly pushed out of Jaffa and Haifa in 1948. So the symbolism of Sheikh Jarrah was the Palestinians being pushed out and the Israelis taking over more houses and land and territory, et cetera, et cetera. Those two things together captured, I think, the attention of the world and sparked the incredible anger of Palestinians who would no longer put up with this happening, with the world just sitting around watching. So there was huge demonstrations in Palestine, and the conflict that we now see between Gaza, between Hamas and etc. But the real issue here is that this is the continuation of policies that have gone on for about 100 years. Now, the Israeli perspective, which you should absolutely hear, and I would love one day to be able to have a discussion between me and an Israeli or pro-Israeli American Zionist at Emmanuel to sit and chat and talk about it in public. That's the best way for the world to hear both sides. So the Israelis will give you reasons why they did everything they did. And some of these reasons are valid. Most of them, in our view, are not. But in the world's view, in the entire world's view, most of the Israeli reasons are not seen to be valid. In other words, the Israelis say they have to do it for defense. They have to do it because this land belongs to them. So the key point is that the Israeli forced eviction of large numbers of people or small numbers of families, whatever it is a crime against refugee law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, and criminal law. There's 4 levels of criminality when you are forcibly evicting people, and the Israelis are involved in all 4 of those in our view. And most of the world, virtually with almost no exceptions, says that the lands of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights are occupied occupied Arab land from the '67 war. And its permanent status has to be negotiated between the parties. In other words, the international humanitarian law and war crimes and crimes against humanity and the apartheid accusations that are now being heard more and more about Israeli actions, these are widely acknowledged by people around the world. But at the same time, there is a massive, unanimous global sense that Israel must be able to exist in peace as a Jewish state or as a majority Jewish state. And this is the question: how do you get to that point where you can get the Israeli government and the settlers and the private thugs to stop their criminal activity, but at the same time spark a process of negotiation between Palestinians and Israelis that can lead to 2 states living side by side, or maybe confederated, or maybe 1 state, whatever they negotiate, that allows Jews and Israelis and Zionists to feel that they can live in a land that is shaped by their Jewish identity. At the same time, they don't have to occupy and just kill and colonize and expel and jail and beat up millions of Palestinians. So that's the great challenge. How do we get compliance with the existing international laws about occupation, about forced expulsion, about settlements and colonization? And there's been many landmarks, so I don't have time to mention them now, but there's been many landmarks along the way that are now being discussed for the first time at a global level. This is the significance of this moment, is that this great response from Palestinians and their supporters around the world to the Sheikh Jarrah moves, the widely recognized criminal moves, criminal being they're against the law, anybody who breaks the law is a criminal. So the Israelis are involved in criminal activity in Sheikh Jarrah. And the massive response of this has been because it has allowed everybody to see what actually has been going on in Palestine. And the Palestinians, for the first time ever, globally, have been able to speak for themselves. If you turn on mainstream TV, if you look at op-eds in the papers, you see very intelligent, articulate, reasonable Palestinians articulating their views, all of them anchored in the issue of the rule of law. We're not saying kill the Jews. We're not saying beat up the Israelis. We're not saying drive them to the sea. We're not saying Israel cannot exist. We're saying exactly the opposite, that we seek a means of coexistence between an Israeli state and a Palestinian state that have equal rights implemented simultaneously, not through the mechanism that the US government has used in massive chronic failures over the last 40 years to try to say the Israelis have the right to security, and then we'll see what the Palestinians get. That was the Kissingerian, Dennis Ross, all these characters who led the American peace negotiations, peace mediation for 30, 40 years and achieved zero. What they've achieved is what you see, expanding death and destruction and animosity. But for the first time now, you have several really historic things happening in this historical context. You have Palestinians speaking for themselves on the world stage. You have the word apartheid being used more frequently as describing Israeli policies, especially after the Human Rights Watch report, and the B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization itself, said what Israel's doing is apartheid. And that is now becoming more common, which is a nightmare for Zionists, but it seems to be a growing trend around the world. And you see, because of those two things, more discussion about the origin of this conflict. Why has this, people are saying, why is this going on every 4 or 5 years? The Israelis occupied Gaza for 15 years. They bombed it every 5, 6 years into smithereens. And why do they have to do it again? It's because the fundamental underlying conflict was never resolved. So people are asking, well, what's the problem? What's the problem? And now, for the first time ever, the world is actually discussing the problem. The Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations mandate of 1922, the UN resolutions of 1947 and 48, all these steps along the way, these landmarks, which I don't have time to get into in detail, but all of these things that happened in the past that were not done with the sense of equal rights to both people. And people are discussing them now. So this is the new situation we're at now. And the last point I'd make is that this is finally, for the first time ever, starting to have an impact on internal American politics. Today only, the Senate and the House were considering resolutions in the US Senate and the House of Representatives to postpone an arms sale of $735 million of the offensive arms, sophisticated attack weapons, postpone that sale to Israel. This is unprecedented. The Israelis usually get anything they want because they've been very sophisticated at their lobbying and using the resources and the assets they have politically and otherwise. And the Arabs have been not very successful. So the Israelis have dominated the American scene for the last 60, 70 years. But this is changing now for the first time ever. And that's the importance of this moment. That's the importance of Sheikh Jarrah. And it should cause us all to look deeper at these issues Acknowledge that Israelis and Palestinians must have equal rights. Ask why we have not been able to achieve that. Ask who has not implemented international law. Ask who has been expanding territorially, building colonies, expelling people, and then ask why have we not been able to resolve this? Those questions have to be answered through a dialogue and discussion and negotiations between the parties, the Palestinians and the Israelis in the first instance, but then all the people around them. The Syrians still have the Golan Heights occupied. The Israelis say they annex it. Most of the world doesn't recognize that. And Arabs, the Muslim countries, friends of Israel, everybody who has a role to play should be involved in this discussion. And that should be our focus moving forward. So we don't have, there's going to be a ceasefire in Gaza, probably tomorrow morning, maybe Saturday morning, we'll see. But if you just have a ceasefire and the Israelis still have a siege on Gaza, and they only allow about 3% of the Palestinians to be vaccinated in the occupied territories because of their colonial apartheid policies, you're not going to have any kind of calm or peace or anything like that. This will explode again. And by the way, every time this happens, the next conflict, you find that the Palestinian militants, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, have more sophisticated arms that reach further into Israel, have more defensive capabilities. And so the power of the Israeli military, which is enormous, and there are several hundred nuclear weapons, are not able to achieve the kind of peace that all people, Israelis and Arabs, deserve. And therefore, I hope, and I'll end with this, that I hope that the Sheikh Jarrah microcosm of Jerusalem, which is a microcosm of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a whole, that's forcing the world to look back over the last 100 years and say, how did we come here? I hope that will push everybody to explore more seriously the legal dimension of what's going on, as well as the political dimension of what are the rights that Israelis and Palestinians should have, and how can we get there. Thank again, Emmanuel College, for partnering with us at AUB to present this short talk and to have this discussion, and I hope it will lead to many more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just invite everybody to send questions forward, and at some point, Natalie's going to raise the questions as well. The question that I have, in this immediate, your last thought there, Rami, is to what extent then, the people become sort of like the conduit of a wider proxy war. We see Hamas and, using much better weaponry, reaching far into and you see all this imagery of the parents who are holding their children, their dead children. So there's a victimization all the way around of what's going on in the region right now. Yesterday I was asked, the day before I was asked about Gaza, to give a comparable kind of what does Gaza look like for a Boston audience, and it's I drew on a Google map, from Hingham to Plymouth in an area of 5 miles in between. And you're that's it, it's a small little strip of 2 million people. So beyond the rest of it, the politics of it, there's a human tragedy that's taking place there. And some of the layers are very political that have to do with geopolitics, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the Arab world. And also, on the other end, internal politics, there's inability to have a voice even within the Palestinian territories, hasn't been an election in 16 years. Or the fact that, failure to have a coalition government in Israel. So some of those things are also layers that also have to be, looked at in some way or another, right? Not just the Israeli-Palestinian, just in the historical context, but inside the box, there's so many different areas that need to be looked at, right?
That's true. It gets more complicated the longer we delay really grappling with the route to a permanent, just, peaceful settlement that's fair to both sides. When the Arab-Israeli conflict, when the Zionism-Arabism conflict started, when it started at the beginning of the 20th century, between, say, 1900 and the Balfour Declaration in 1917, then the mandate from the League of Nations, which gave the British and the French control over the Syria area, which included Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Now, when that started, there was about 150,000 people in Palestine. Most of them Arabs, some of them Jews, all of them indigenous local people who had lived there for centuries, including my family in Nazareth, where we still live in our own home. Those 150,000 Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Palestine have now become 20 million. About 8 million Jews, about 8 million Israelis, most of whom are Jews, and about 12 million Palestinians. So you're dealing now with 20 million people. It would have been much easier to solve the conflict back when it was 150,000 people. But so with time, it gets more complicated and more external players come in. So you mentioned Iran. Iran was a very close strategic ally of Israel under the Shah, and they were giving Israel oil and arms and other stuff. And South Africa was a very close strategic ally of Israel, the original apartheid state. Now South Africa is critical of Israel, Iran is critical of Israel. These things change. Turkey now is kind of coming and going, and one day it's very close to the Palestinians, one day it's making up with the Israelis and being close strategic partners and having joint military exercises, and then the Turks are very erratic now, but so these regional players change, and of course you're seeing the Gulf countries, the UAE and Bahrain, and their leaderships have made peace agreements with Israel. Their people are not so sure about that, and this is something we see in Morocco and other places around the region. So of course these things change over time. What hasn't changed over time has been the ironclad American government commitment to the Israeli state security. For many reasons, again, which I don't have time to get into, but the Zionist movement, the Israeli government have done a masterful job at cementing this relationship based on a lot of things they've said, which I would argue are either lies or exaggerations, but based on real, genuine linkages between the American political system, the American people, and the Israeli people and government. But this is changing now. So this is so these things evolve over time, and you're getting now a majority of young Jewish Americans want the U.S. government to sanction Israel for some of its human rights abuses against the Palestinians. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. And the last time Netanyahu went to speak at the Congress, something like 65 members of Congress refused to go because they didn't want to hear him speak as a protest. So these are little signs of change. And remember, change in these big issues happens slowly over time. Women getting the vote, Black people getting their full civil rights, environmental activists working for the good of nature, women working to stop being sexually abused and degraded. These things changed over about a century. So big sticker items don't change quickly, but what we have to be able to do, which I'm saying we should do literally today, is see the incremental small signs of historic changes coming. And we're seeing that today in the United States. You saw it in the bill in the Congress today. So we have to kind of grapple with all of these things, but the core thing is the Israelis and the Palestinians. I've been involved in many track 2 negotiations with Israelis, private Israelis, former officials, whatever, and we've done this, 10 or 20 times. We find middle ground that unites us. I've done surveys, scholarly work with Israelis and Palestinians, trying to identify what is it they really want, what are they willing to do to give the other side what it wants and to get what they want. We know from personal experience, Israelis and Palestinians, that there is a middle ground where they can live together in peace. They probably have to be in 2 states now, but eventually they'll probably peacefully merge, get closer, like the European Union, slowly, people got closer. But the reality is that the Israelis and the Palestinians drive this process. So if the Israelis and the Palestinians, if movements that represent their people, credible movements that genuinely represent the majority of their people, can negotiate something reasonable for them both, the world will follow them. There's no question about that. And so we saw that in South Africa, we saw that in Northern Ireland, and we saw something else in South Africa and Northern Ireland. We saw serious mediation in Northern Ireland by the United States. So the US can be a serious mediator, but it never really wanted to be in Palestine and Israel. And in South Africa, we saw the power of public protest and boycott. And that's one of the things that brought apartheid to its knees in South Africa. And they finally negotiated, and the white people who stayed in South Africa, which is the majority, are living decent lives, and they just don't have colonial control over a subjugated Black population. And the same will happen in Palestine. The Jewish Israelis will live peacefully in their country with security guarantees, etc. They just will not live as a colonial, occupying, expanding, apartheid racist power that subjugates, kills, and destroys the lives of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and expels them, etc., etc. All the things that it's doing. That will all end once a serious negotiation happens. But you're right to point out the many complexities, but those complexities have happened because the core elements that have to be defined by the two principal players, the Israelis and the Palestinians, those core elements were never grappled with seriously. Almost they had a close encounter with the rationality when Rabin and Arafat agreed on Oslo, and then for various reasons on both sides, it didn't work, it fell apart. So this is what we have to really focus on, getting the Israelis and Palestinians to understand that they must, for their own well-being, negotiate an agreement now, because the 20 million today are going to be 50 million in a while, and then it's going to be impossible.
Thank you, Mr. Khouri. I see that we have a question from Professor Prodromou. Dr. Prodromou, the floor is yours. Feel free.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Rami. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for making an incredibly complex set of facts on the ground, very accessible. And thank you for putting things into historical context and local context. I have just two questions. I mean, one is a very simple one. Besides political leadership, who else do you see as potentially important and significant in, first of all, helping the two parties move to an immediate cessation of violence? You're a journalist, a former journalist, current journalist. How much can the media do to help reach a ceasefire? But then secondly, I wanted to ask about some of the local politics involved in what's happening, because you I think very compellingly outlined the disproportionate use of force and asymmetries in the facts on the ground. But I also wanted to ask about some other micro politics. And here I mean what seems to be the great cynicism of both the Israeli government and Hamas leadership in what's happening on the ground. We know that Israel has had 4 elections in the last 2 years. They've been unable to form a working government. Netanyahu is indicted for corruption. So in many ways, violence is a distraction from that fact. And the flip side of that is we also know that recently the Palestinian Authority indefinitely postponed elections in the Palestinian territories. I think probably over concerns, at least that's what the survey data suggests, that they may lose the elections. So to Hamas. And so in some ways, this is an opportunity for Hamas to produce its own bona fides in a population with which they're losing their own legitimacy because they have evolved from a national liberation movement and self-determination movement to an Islamist movement. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the cynicism that's at work on both sides when it comes to allowing this violence to continue. And maybe that's a misread. And if it is, to correct that reading. But that's, I think, one way of thinking about it. And the suffering then is the human suffering that you've described.
Yeah, it's not a misreading. I think it's just 1 or 2 elements I would adjust in my view. Hamas did not evolve from a nationalist movement into armed resistance movement. It's the other way around. They were a religious movement, the Muslim Brothers, and then they evolved into a nationalist political movement, and then they adopted armed struggle, including use of what anybody would call terrorism. If you bomb a pizza parlor, or and some of the attacks now are more complicated to assess, and this is where we need the lawyers. We got to get the lawyers on this, honest lawyers, not ideologically driven zealot lawyers and wild men and women. Honest lawyers to tell us what is the actual legal right of Israel to defend itself from a population that it occupies and lays siege to. Is the self-defense right absolutely clear in that sense, or are there restrictions? And what is the right of the Palestinians or any occupied people to resist using any force that they want, which both of these are given in law, that you can defend yourself and you can defend yourself against occupation, you can defend yourself against, you can resist if you're occupied, and you can defend yourself if you're attacked. But the definitions are fuzzy, so that has to be looked at. I don't honestly believe that either Netanyahu, who I believe leads a criminally designed government to do what they're doing. What they've done is just criminal in terms of a law. I use the word criminal intentionally, not just to trash talk them, but to say that their behavior is contrary to international law. They are committing crimes, and if you commit a crime, you're a criminal. They're criminally focused in their activities of settlement, expansion, expulsion, etc., etc. But even them, I don't think that these people would deliberately prolong a battle that is causing such grief to the Israeli people and highlighting to the Israelis the futility of armed strength as the primary means of your security. This is what's so fascinating. You know, years ago, they occupied Gaza. They said, oh, okay, we're going to get rid of these people. They occupied them. That didn't work. They got out. And then they said, we're going to build fence. We're going to build a wall. That didn't work. We're going to lay siege to them. That didn't work. We're going to prevent them from crossing our border. So they just started using rockets. So the lessons of Hezbollah and Hamas, the two armed Islamist militant movements that have challenged Israel, should keep every Israeli awake at night thinking about what their government is doing. And to the point that Hezbollah and Hamas eventually will reach that point, if this continues, which I hope it doesn't, that they would realize that Hezbollah has forced Israel into a mutual deterrence on the Lebanese-Israeli border. The Israelis and Hezbollah have an agreement that's been negotiated. If you kill one of our soldiers, we kill one of your soldiers. That's it. Neither of them want to make a full war, because if they do, there's going to be massive destruction, and mostly by civilians on both sides. The capabilities of Hezbollah now are way greater than they used to be before. And you can see Hamas's capabilities increase every time there's a war. So this is a terrible trajectory. I don't think Netanyahu would deliberately, criminal and crude as he is, vulgar as he is in his actions and his words, I don't think he would, as a human being, want to keep Israelis feeling this. And the same, I would say, for Hamas. For all of the work that they do that we can criticize, they know they're a minority in Palestine. They know the majority of Palestinians don't want to be subjected to this kind of recurring wars and destruction. They certainly don't want to have perpetual warfare between them and siege. And they do this because they've run out of options. The Palestinian government has been incompetent, corrupt, and inefficient, and a serial failure. The Israeli government similarly, the American mediation similarly. The Americans are politically chromosomally unable to mediate a fair peace. They've done it for 40 years and nothing has come out of it. They just can't do it. I mean, Biden is having trouble coming out and saying the Palestinians and the Israelis have equal rights to live in security in their homes and not be bombed. He's not able to say that. He keeps saying, I want a ceasefire now. The Palestinians have to live in dignity. The Israelis have the right to defend themselves. There's always a nuanced difference between the absolute right of the Israelis for real security and total military use to defend themselves, and the quantified, qualified, tentative secondary rights of the Palestinians to get somewhere near that. So people talk of Palestinian statehood and security, and they talk of Palestinian aspirations. Well, we don't want aspirations. We want security. We want statehood. We want full human dignity recognized. We want to live like Israel lives. We don't want to be better than the Israelis, because we're not. So that idea, which is common in the press, which is one of the problems, most of the global press coverage is pretty lousy historically, mainly because I believe it's been so badly distorted by pro-Israeli Zionist influences in very effective public relations and propaganda. But that's breaking down now. So if you look at I'm in the US now, and you look at the media in the US, it's extraordinary. Not social media, just mainstream media. It's extraordinary, the views of Palestinians. So this is changing. And the media is an issue that has to be improved. And I think that's a self-improvement, self-correction is taking place. You mentioned other communities. The business community has a big role to play. The boycott of South Africa was a huge factor. Sporting events, when athletes around the world wave Palestinian flags, that should scare the Israelis, because it means they want justice. And they're going to do what they did in South Africa. They're going to boycott the Israelis like they're going to boycott the South Africans. So there's other dimensions: business, media, sports, the educational community. Curricula should be revised so that, or made in a way that really teach both sides of the conflict, so that people learn what the views of both sides and make their own decision based on what is international law requiring of these people who are fighting for a whole century. And then, of course, the last people to change will be the political crowd, the people in Washington and in London, because the politicians are not normal human beings. They don't respond to normal human emotions and values. They just want money, they want votes, they want support, they want to stay in power, they're addicted to power, they don't care about anything except their incumbency, and therefore they will do whatever they feel is going to help them do that. So they ultimately follow once the public sphere evolves and changes. I believe we're seeing that happen, as I said, and it's just exciting days to watch this happen. And I hope it pushes both the Israelis and Palestinians to engage seriously. The problem is that we have criminal leaderships on both sides, really criminal. The Palestinian leadership, the Israeli leadership, and we have a half-asleep American leadership. The Americans don't want to be involved in this. They want to get out of Afghanistan. They want to get out of Syria. They want to fix Iran. The last thing they want is to get into this. So we'll see what happens coming up. But these are important elements that you want to keep your eye on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rami.
Thank you very much, Ms. Prodromou. And at this time, I'd like to ask our audience to send your questions if you have any questions. And thank you so much for your for answering our questions. I have a question that I'm curious about. You mentioned the Palestinian leadership, and one thing that I've been wondering is, why is there a divide between the Gaza leadership and the West Bank leadership? And I was curious, how is that divide affecting the Palestinian cause overall?
The divide between them?
Yeah.
Historically, Gaza has always had a little bit of its own identity politically, with a strong Islamist element, partly because of its close links with Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood started, and other reasons. And because when it was physically after 67, after the creation of Israel, it was divided from the rest of Palestine. You've always had these slightly different historical, political, and identity trajectories. Then what happened was the political leaderships, the political leadership under the PLO and Arafat between, let's say, the late 60s and the mid 90s, and I lived through that period, and I'm a little older than I look. I was born in 1948, so I've experienced this whole thing throughout my life. as the Palestinian leadership reached its kind of peak of national unity and a desire to negotiate with Israel, a major historic compromise we made with the Israelis, essentially saying we'll live in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and we'll recognize the Israeli state. That was the kind of high watermark of a unified Palestinian position. It didn't go anywhere. The Oslo process, the Madrid talks started, they didn't get anywhere. The Oslo process then got moving, and it started to make a little advance, and then Rabin was assassinated by people like the people who are now throwing out the people from Sheikh Jarrah, these ultra-nationalist, zealot, extremist, militant, hard-headed, violent settlers who think that they have the right to this land, nobody else has the right to this land, and they're going to do what they need to, and even if they have to take out their guns and shoot people. And we're seeing videos every day of Palestinians, kids being shot by Israeli settlers mostly, not Israeli army people, which is an interesting change. So the high point of Palestinian national leadership was in the mid-90s, and then when Oslo started to fail, you had a bigger split, and of course Hamas became more prominent. They adopted a militant techniques of resistance, including terror attacks, bombing cafes and stuff in Israel, as well as political resistance. And so you started to get a divergence between them, and then the Israelis so brutalized Gaza with sieges and occupations and attacks on colonies and taking their water and everything, that and their arable land, and that the extremist, the anger of ordinary people turned into political extremism and really strong feelings that helped the militant movement grow like it has grown, and then the PLO became corrupted and inefficient and lazy. So you've got these bunch of these old men sitting in Ramallah, and they're mostly old men, very few women. Some of the women are great, like Hanan Ashrawi. She left the leadership because she realized that this was a failure. So that we have a terrible Palestinian leadership situation with a split with Hamas and Fatah, and the incompetence of both in governing. You can say Hamas has been actually pretty effective, and some of their militancy, you can argue whether it's the right route to take. And personally, I hear both arguments, and I'm not quite sure which one is the most logical. I would always argue for the rule of law, that we should follow the rule of law. But you can argue whether Hamas is right or wrong to do what it's doing, but forget about what they do with the Israelis. What they do with their own people is not at all impressive. They're terrible at running the daily lives and giving people what they need. Partly, of course, they're under siege by the Israelis. So you can never separate the Palestinian reality from the policies of the Israeli government. And this is one of the complexities. So any point that you raise, any point I've mentioned today, you can hear an Israeli government viewpoint or a settler viewpoint that will take every point I made and give you a different reason why I'm wrong. And you should hear those viewpoints. You should absolutely hear those viewpoints. Better yet, get an Israeli and a Palestinian together who can calmly talk to each other and discuss these issues and break this siege of the mindset of the Western world that has been so crudely dominated by Israeli propaganda over the last 100 years. That siege is now broken. And we need to open the floodgates of knowledge and truth and facts and the rule of law. And the Israelis shouldn't be afraid of that. The Israelis, like the Palestinians, will have to make historic compromises like we made on our side, because we understood the reality of the march of history, that the Israeli state was there, it's not going away. We better come to terms with it. And we did. The Israelis have not done the same thing to us. And our leadership in Gaza and Fatah have been totally incompetent at responding. And that's why you're seeing the drive now is a lot of it, everything that happened in the West Bank and in Israel proper, these demonstrations were all done by young people, not traditional leaders. So this is, again, an important turning point that you're seeing not only in Palestine and Israel, but also around the entire Arab world. with these mass demonstrations to change corrupt regimes.
Thank you, Mr. Khouri. I see that we have a question from Professor Sami. Thank you for a great presentation. Do you think a two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be a reasonable solution or just another distant prospect? How do you generally define a negotiated resolution if we have a criminal leadership on both sides?
Well, you change the leadership, first of all. You get better leaders, and that has happened over time, but we'll see if it happens here or not. You need better governance. You need leaderships that have legitimacy and efficacy, that they can legitimately represent the rights and will of their people and the values of their people, and they can negotiate with the opposite side in an efficacious way, that they can achieve something. As happened again in South Africa and Northern Ireland, I often refer to those two as really, really tough historical problems that were resolved. And I hope one day the Cyprus dispute also, which is one of the toughest, will be resolved as well, the situation in Cyprus. And you have others, Nepal and I don't know where, that are all really tough issues to resolve. But the two-state solution is harder to achieve now because of the last 53 years of Israeli colonization and expelling Palestinians and taking over people's land and houses. But it's still doable, and people are coming up with a very creative new ideas that are not just traditional, saying the Israelis get out of the West Bank like they got out of Sinai, for instance. The Israelis had settlements in northern Sinai. They got out to make peace with Egypt, which was the right thing to do. That's more difficult to do now, but probably the solution is that they get out of most of the settlements that are not right along the border. So the big Israeli towns right along the Green Line, the border, would become part of Israel, and Israel would give us land in return of equal value. So that you would, and then the smaller settlements all over the West Bank that are farther away would be abandoned because they're criminal settler colonial outposts. They don't have the right to exist. The whole world says that they're an obstacle to peace, and they need to be removed. And the Israelis have done that before. They can do it again. So I think we should still try to go for a two-state solution. We might have to accept something in between, but based on equal rights, not the comical nonsense that Jared Kushner and his band of criminals, political criminals, came up with in their ideas for the peace, this ridiculous cartoon peace plan that they came up with. That didn't go anywhere. Nobody in the world supported it, virtually, except a couple of tiny little countries that had no real impact and probably did it because they thought they were going to make some financial gains out of it. But nobody in the world supported it. Nobody serious in the world supported it. So you need a genuine, viable Palestinian state and a secure Israeli state and a resolution of the refugee issue. And if the Israelis want to raise the issue of Jews who left Arab land and a few were kicked out of Arab lands, raise it, absolutely. We are totally with international law. International law says refugees have the right to return home, or restitution or compensation. We are 100%. So send me a list of all the Jews in Israel or their descendants who want to go back to Baghdad and Morocco and Yemen. Send it to me and I will get it done with the Arab leaderships. But that's not going to happen because a lot of those Jews who went to Israel wanted to go to live in a Jewish state. Not all of them, but anyway, there was movements of different people, but the Palestinians were forcibly thrown out and their land was annexed and taken over. So these are complex issues, but they all have resolution. They have a resolution with one common element, which is that the individual and the national rights of both sides must be first identical and second implemented simultaneously. And that's doable. It can be done. So that's what we should aim for, or a mixture of a West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem Arab state and an Israeli state like it exists more or less, but they share some things together, like security, like water, like maybe a joint justice system, something. So they're not totally separate, because it's very hard to disengage these populations. And by the way, there was about 530 Palestinian villages and hamlets that were destroyed by Israel, razed to the ground, most of them. When 47-48 happened, the Israeli state was created. 750,000 Palestinians fled or were driven out, mostly driven out. Some fled. But their towns and their little villages and settlements were pretty much destroyed by the Israelis. Some of them they turned into forests and nature zones or whatever. A nice way to put lipstick on a pig and to fix up colonialism or something nice. Those towns or those areas where the Palestinians used to live are mostly still uninhabited. If you're interested in this, go to something called the Palestine Lands Project, Palestine Lands, LANDS Project, which is the work of a tremendous Palestinian scholar, Salman Abu Sitti, who spent the last 50 years identifying every town that was ethnically cleansed, where it was, where its people went, and he's got an atlas of Palestine and shows this. So our link to our land in Palestine is as strong as the link of any Jew in the world to the land that they believe is their national home in Palestine. The difference is the majority of the 12 million Palestinians are living in and around Palestine. They're not going anywhere. They're still hanging around, like myself, like my kids, like my parents. We're still, we have not given up, we'll never give up the quest for a peaceful resolution of our refugeehood and exile and statelessness and disenfranchisement. We will keep struggling to achieve that peacefully and equitably, knowing that it can only be achieved if the Israelis have the same right. This is new for us. We didn't think this way 30, 40 years ago, but people change over time. And therefore, the long answer to your short question is the two-state solution should still be attempted, but it might have to be modified a little bit. The one-state solution, where all Palestinians and Israelis live in one country with equal rights, is preferable. And that was our position way back in the 1950s and 60s, but the Israelis don't want it. Zionism is a movement of national reconstitution of the Jewish people. They want a Jewish state. That's what Zionism is. And it's a perfectly noble mission if they find a piece of land that's really empty and build their state. That would be fantastic. And they deserve a state. If they feel they're a state, if they feel they're a country, and the way they were mistreated by Christian white people in Europe and North America and Russia, before the Holocaust, by the way, the Holocaust vastly speeded up this process. But the idea of a Jewish state and starting to colonize Palestine and clashes in Palestine started in the teens and the 20s and the 30s before the advent of the Holocaust, which just made it even more urgent. So the link of the Palestinians to their land is in a way even stronger than the Israeli links, because I still have I should have brought them with me. I have the deeds. My wife's family owns the land where the University of Tel Aviv is built. If any of you go to the University of Tel Aviv, call me up one day and tell me what building you went to, and I will show you from the deeds I have in our safe at home. We own this land. We never gave it to anybody. We never sold it to anybody. My wife's family had been orange farmers, citrus farmers in Palestine for 50, 60 years. So anyway, these are all, so you see, when you start talking about any issue, you get into other issues, the history, the agriculture, the identity, the political struggle, the legal situation, the external actors. All of these things are very intertwined, but they have a simple core. The core being that Palestinians and Israelis share similar identification with that piece of land. They both feel they have the right to live there. They are both living there, but in a occupier way. The Israelis are much stronger, and neither of them are going to give up and run away. They will both fight to the death if they have to, and they've done it many times. And they both are willing to try to negotiate some kind of resolution, but that is less likely to happen now. If 25, 30 years ago, the public opinion in Israel was much more amenable to a negotiated two-state resolution of the conflict. Today, most Israelis and most Palestinians will tell you it's never going to happen. And the whole political system in Israel has moved to the right. And among Palestinians, much of it has also moved to the right with Hamas. So time is running against all of our interests. And we really need to address this issue urgently. And hopefully the changes happening today will push us in that direction.
Well, we have one last question from Dr. Prodromou, and I want to thank you for even staying a little bit longer than we originally had talked about. So I think it's very, very engaging conversation. So without Dr. Prodromou.
And thank you for indulging me with a second question. Just as a follow-up to your first responses, Rami, who specifically do you think has both the legitimacy but also the will to take on the diplomatic task that you outlined? I mean, you again compellingly argued that this issue needs to be resolved through diplomacy. It's not resolvable through force. So, and you roundly critiqued, and I think justifiably so, the U.S. for its failure and/or inability to act as an honest broker. So, what country or what institution, multilateral organization might be take the diplomatic lead? And then the second, coming back to your point about the sea change in the media coverage, what do you think accounts for that? But also, what do you think accounts for the media's ongoing blind spot? And by that, I mean their tendency to reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a Jewish-Muslim conflict, which completely overlooks the indigenous Christian community of the Holy Lands, as well as Druze and other non-Jews and non-Muslims. Because, I mean, it's really, in particular, the Christian community, which is being squeezed out and marginalized completely, and the Druze community as well. And so you started about Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's a perfect microcosm of the disappearance of the historic pluralism in that ancient city. So what accounts do you think for the media's sea change, but also for their failure to recognize that this once was a very culturally and religiously plural space, and the value of recognizing that for any kind of a durable, sustainable diplomatic solution?
Thank you for those two questions. I'll answer them briefly because we run out of time. The mediator issue, there's no single mediator that you can point to now who would be accepted by the Israelis and Palestinians both to play the major mediating role. The US had that position for the last 30, 40 years or so and completely blew it and acted with a combination of incompetence and inequality in terms of the rights of both sides that will go down in the history of political mediation as one of the great failures, serial failures of modern diplomacy. And it started, of course, with Henry Kissinger way back then, because the Kissingerian view, which was then followed by Dennis Ross and other people in think tanks in Washington, was that you've got to make the Israelis feel secure. Once the Israelis are secure, they will make a reasonable negotiated compromise. Well, they've been making Israel secure for 50 years. It's by law in the American Congress, Israel must be kept stronger than all the combination of the countries around it, and it is. And it's still occupying and colonizing and killing and incarcerating and torturing and doing all kinds of terrible things. So that American legacy is a real problem because there's no single mediator who can really take over right now. So I think the answer is we need some kind of international mechanism. It could be through the Security Council. It could be through a new conference like the Madrid conference in 1992, I think it was, the first real negotiation. Some new mechanism that includes the US, but also includes other parties, the Europeans, the Russians, the various people who are interested. It can be done. Some combination of players can be done as long as the United States, which is the single most critical one, if the United States says it is willing to be part of an international negotiating mechanism, that will allow the Israelis to feel more secure. But just making the Israelis secure isn't going to bring about peace. You've got to make them rational and reasonable and law-abiding, and that hasn't happened at the political realm. And other things, they're very rational and reasonable, and the Israelis are incredibly impressive people in terms of what they've achieved, but they're also criminal in what they've done vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And this is what the world is telling them now when it says, well, why are you acting like an apartheid state? So the US has to be there with a group of other people. The media issue is quite simple. I've been in the media for 50 years now, 52 actually, since my days in college in the United States. And I've watched the transitions happen over the generations. I've worked for major American media like the Washington Post, and I've written the New York Times, Boston Globe, many others. I know them well. I appear on TV a lot. I interact with the media a lot. And my conclusion is that the media is a commercial operation that wants to make money, and it makes money by selling dog food and cruise line trips. And in other words, all they want to do is get an audience that they can sell advertising to get money from the advertisers to reach a bigger audience. They're not, with some exceptions, they're not committed to a serious examination of the truth or the complexities of any of these conflicts. And they haven't done it in India and Pakistan. They haven't done it in Cyprus very much. It's a structural weakness of the commercial media. And the problem is that Palestine is very far away. You know, I've lived in the US for about half my life, and I've seen how people react. It's oh, those people, they've been fighting for 2,000 years. No, they've been only fighting since really 1915. But the media doesn't go into that. It doesn't see it as its job, and it doesn't see it as increasing dog food advertising income, because most readers don't want that level of nuance and etc. So that's one of the main problems. The advent of social media and digital media that allows small groups of people to exist without having
hear us, but we can't hear you very well. I think our connection just, can you hear us? I think we lost you there for a little while. Yeah. We can't hear you very well. You're coming in. Anyway, maybe this is a cue for all of us. I couldn't thank you enough, Rami, for doing this. I think it's been a great hour plus of having an open discussion. I really want to thank the audience for participating. I really want to thank Natalie and Maria and Julia for pulling this together. my esteemed colleague, Dr. Prodromou, for being present in this and continuing the conversation next week with the Israeli Consul General or the Vice General, continuing the conversation, hopefully in the same kind of a way that we had it this week, which was really, really brilliant in a way that put some light on a very complex issue. And I think we're really proving the fact that we can recast the region from an Eastern Mediterranean perspective with a complexity that the region deserves, and not the superficiality that selling dog food and cruise tours that my good friend Rami Khouri just mentioned. So I want to thank everybody again and have a very nice afternoon, and hope to see everybody back next Thursday at 12:30 with continuing this conversation. Rami, if I may, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the American University of Beirut and the Global Engagement Initiative, and looking forward to further collaborations. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.